Hello, and welcome to chapter 6 through 8. We're going to be talking about two-dimensional media. In these next chapters, in chapter 6 through 8, and then 11 through 13, we're discussing what the artists used to create their artwork, which is also known as media. We divided that into two-dimensional media, which we're talking about today, and then three-dimensional media, which are chapters 11 through 13. The first media that we're going to talk about is drawing. And drawing is something that everybody does at some point or another, either when you're a child or doodling in class, whatever it might be. To draw means to pull, push, or drag a marking tool across a surface to leave a line or mark. And it's a natural impulse. I mean, when you're a kid or a toddler, you want to draw in the dirt, pick up a stick and draw in the dirt. So it's something that everybody does again. And part of the reason of that is that it's very accessible, and they're familiar materials that we use, such as pencil, pen, chalk, or paper, excuse me. The functions of drawing can be an end in itself. It can be a complete artwork, or it can be a notation, sketch, or record of something seen, remembered, or imagined. So just kind of like if you're out drawing, you might just sketch something really quickly that you see to record it. Or it could be a study or preparation for a larger work. The first drawings that we're going to look at fulfill that last function. So it's a study or a preparation for a larger work. This is a sketch for Picasso's Guernica, and in it you can see that he has created a very almost rapid, very loose sketch of the composition, kind of just laying out some of the major elements that are going to be in his later work. This is a later sketch in which you can see there's a lot more detail present, but it's still quickly done. You can see like some of the pencil marks here, for example, very rapid, almost like coloring very, very, very quickly. But you see more of the composition, more of the detail. So this is the end painting, and you can see that there are a lot of similarities, such as kind of the layout of the most important elements. So for example, you see the bull here, you see a bull here, figure with the lantern coming in here, same here. But there are some differences. So you can see there's a horse here in the middle screaming. We don't see that in the sketch. So the sketches are going to be done to plan things out, whereas the painting is going to be the finished product in this case. Another artist who drew quite a bit was Edgar Degas. This is Dancer Adjusting Her Slipper. That's made out of graphite and charcoal from 1873. Again, this is a sketch, and you can see that part of it is more complete than the other part. So for example, her body, her torso, her arms, and then if you look at her dress, it's just kind of this rapid sketch to kind of capture the shape and the movement of her leg. You can see there's a grid laid over it, so that grid is there for to transfer to a larger surface, so you can see exactly where the composition should be on the larger surface. Drawing is a learned process, so some people you can just do it automatically, but most of the time it's going to be learned and not just an inborn gift. A great example of that is Vincent van Gogh, who we all know is a very well-known painter. This is his Carpenter from 1880. In it, we're seeing an image of a kind of stiff, clumsy, proportioned man, but he is revealing careful observation and attention to detail. So if you look at the hands, for example, very detailed, the tools that he's using, very detailed, but the figure itself feels very stiff. So here he's struggling to kind of reveal the world in two dimensions. Whereas in a later work, just 2 years later, this is Old Man with his head in his hands, we can see that he's portraying a much more convincing three-dimensional look on a two-dimensional surface. He's portraying the grief of the old man as well as the solidity of figure. So we get a sense of the emotion, but we also get a sense of the three-dimensionality of the figure. And you can see that the way that he's portrayed the chair at an angle here, whereas in the earlier piece, everything is just kind of on horizontal lines. So get a real sense of how he grew as an artist during these couple of years. So when we're talking about drawing, there's several different media within drawing. First is the dry media, and then we also have wet media. Dry media includes pencil, charcoal, pastel, and Conte crayon. Wet media includes ink. And all of these materials are going to have pigments. Pigments are powdered colored material mixed with an adherent, a binder. And they're all the media are going to be based, or all the drawing media is going to be divided into these dry and wet medias. With ink, you can either use a pen or a brush within the wet media. So this is a pencil and paper piece, Prince Among Thieves with Flowers by Ofili from 1999. This is a drawing, and it's done as a completed piece. It's made out of dry media, which is pencil in this case. Where you press, or where you have a harder lead, the lines are going to be lighter because it takes more pressure to get that harder lead to create an image. So for example, in the background you can see this lighter image. That's going to be done with the hard lead, and then the soft lead is going to be these darker areas, which are actually these little dots that create this implied line, are actually tiny little heads. Another artist who used dry media in her work, this is Georgia O'Keeffe, and this is a charcoal drawing, a completed piece in its own right. So with charcoal, you're able to get gradations of tone. So you can see how it goes from light to medium to a little bit darker and then to really dark. And it's just this very subtle transition from lights to darks. And in this case, it's creating a very dramatic structure as kind of a flower that becomes more kind of a monumental sculptural mass. George Seurat also used dry media. This is Conte crayon in his study for Béarnais Astornay from 1882. He's using chiaroscuro. Remember that technique of that overall lighting where you go from lights to darks in this very smooth transitional method. You can actually see the texture of the paper represented here. So you can see how it's not a really fine paper, it's more of a rough paper. And that kind of mimics what he did later on with his painting of with the pointillism. This is The Singer in Green by Degas, another dry media. In this case, it's chalk pastel. Edgar Degas was a painter in his beginning in his career, but actually switched to pastel later in his career. In this work, you can see a lot of different techniques that the artist is using with chalk pastels. So, for example, in the background here, you can see how he's blended the chalk pastels. Then we have certain areas where you can see like the actual line that the pastel made. You can see the texture of the paper represented here. And then again, if you look at her skin tone, it's very blended from lights to darks to create this really nice transition of colors. So chalk pastel can actually mimic painting if you blend it well enough, but one of the giveaways here that this is chalk pastel is going to be how it's revealing the texture of the paper in the background. So here we have wet media. This is Rembrandt's Cottage Among Trees from 1648. And he has used both a pen and a brush and ink within this piece. So liquid media is going to give you more of a smooth, uninterrupted line. It's permanent, so you can't make mistakes, or you're just going to have to start over. And the thickness and thinness of the line becomes an important variable within wet media drawings. And that's what we call calligraphic line when it goes from thin to thick. So we can see these things represented here. He used a reed pen with ink to do the lines of the drawing. And then you can see how some of the drawing appears to be darker than the rest. And you can see that really well right here. Like the paper looks darker. And that's what we call a wash, in which the ink was diluted with water and then applied with a brush. So that added some solidity to the cottage, as well as softened shadows underneath the trees. So you can imagine, I mean, it appears to be very rapid, very, very kind of loose technique, but the amount of precision that it took to create that, you can imagine, was pretty impressive. This is Matisse's piece from 1952. Again, we're seeing a drawing as an end product. In this case, wet media ink with a brush. So this is kind of interesting because he's taking ink and he's brushing it onto a ground, a surface. In this case, it just happens to be ink and the ground happens to be paper. So it kind of makes you wonder, well, where does drawing end and painting begin? Well, one of the main differences is that it's done on paper, it's more linear, and it's going to be black and white. But these qualities that we consider to be drawing in Western culture, in Eastern culture are considered to be painting, and is one of the highest forms of painting, which we can see here, a Chinese piece from the Yuan Dynasty, 1372. So moving on to painting. Painting is the most prominent media used in Western art. Part of the reason is that it's full of color. We also see it oftentimes framed. It becomes kind of this precious object. And it's also a focus of energy that an artist will spend a lot of time on. When we're talking about painting, we're going to be talking of a material that's made with three elements: pigment, binder, and vehicle. Pigment is going to provide the color. The binder holds the pigment particles together and attaches the paint to the support. And then the vehicle is going to be there to spread the pigment. And an example of that would be oil. With oil paint, it's going to be turpentine. With tempera paint, it's going to be water. Then we have the support or ground, which I've kind of mentioned. That is the prepared surface to which the paint is applied. So it can be something like canvas, wood, plaster, cardboard, etc. Sometimes the artist will also use a primer, and a primer seals the support or ground with chalk or glue, and it prepares it to receive the paint. So instead of just painting on raw canvas, you're going to see most artists prepare that canvas with some sort of glue so that the canvas can be protected and won't degrade over time. There are several different types of painting that we're going to talk about in this chapter. So we can see encaustic, fresco, tempera, oil, watercolor, and acrylic are the different types of paint that we'll be discussing. So first off is encaustic. Encaustic is basically pigment that's been mixed with wax and resin. So the binder is the wax. It gives you vibrant color and it lasts over time for a very, very long time. So this is actually a Roman piece, Young Woman with a Gold Pectoral, from 100 to 150. So you can see it's a couple thousand years old, and it retains the original color, the transitions from light to dark, very, very vibrant color. This particular piece was made to memorialize the dead, and several or many encaustic paintings during this time were used for this purpose. This is another encaustic, more recent, from 1958, Numbers in Color from Jasper Johns. And in it you can see the ability of encaustic to build up layers. He actually painted on layers of newspaper, and then that would add texture to the painting as well. So moving on to fresco painting. In fresco painting, the binder is going to be water and your support is going to be plaster. So this is a very important aspect to fresco painting. There are two types of fresco painting. One that is called dry or fresco secco. This is when the plaster is dry and you're painting that water on dry plaster. And then you have wet fresco or buon fresco, true fresco, which is where you're painting it on while the plaster is still wet. With frescoes, you're mostly going to see more muted hues, as opposed to like the encaustic where you can see a little bit more rich color. What we're looking at here is the Sistine Chapel ceiling by Michelangelo from 1508. And a lot of the times fresco painting will be used as wall paintings because you're using plaster, so you can apply plaster to walls or ceilings. And it gives you that strong support that you'll need. In this piece, you can see a lot of Renaissance ideals such as perfection, beauty, naturalism, and noble principles. So frescoes have actually survived from ancient Mediterranean civilizations, and this is a great example of that. This is Landscape with Swallows from the Minoan culture in Greece from 1650 BCE. So here you can get a real good sense of those muted colors. So even though it's the primary colors, red, blue, and yellow, they're not as intense as like a color wheel, for example, a primary would be. But you also have to keep in mind that this is several thousand years old. I love this piece. I love how whimsical and playful it is. But you have to remember when we're looking at fresco painting that this is a very difficult technique. When you are painting on plaster, it is more permanent. It's not something that you can just paint over. So if you make a mistake, you're going to have to cut that plaster away and start over. This is a beautiful piece by Raphael. Again, we're looking at a Renaissance piece, and it's a great example of linear perspective as well. A more recent artist using this method was Diego Rivera. This is a detail of his Detroit Industry mural from 1932 to 33. In it, you can actually see some of the texture of the plaster being visible. So for example, if you look at the floor here, you can see that the texture of the plaster is showing up through that paint. As the chemical reaction between paint and plaster happens, it happens very slowly, and colors will deepen over years and years. So artists kind of have to plan for that whenever they're painting on fresco to make sure that their colors are going to be what they want them to be in the end. But their hues will always have somewhat of a muted tone, as opposed to what we're going to look at in a minute with oil paintings, where it's going to be more rich and vibrant. This is just the overall view of that mural, in which you can see, again, how murals can be, or a fresco painting can be used to create murals. So moving on to tempera. In tempera, you're going to have a binder that is made of an emulsion or egg. It's kind of interesting. One of the qualities that is that it dries quickly. And then it can be used to create a luminous effect as you're building up layers. Usually it's used on a wood panel that's prepared with a gesso, which is a mixture of white pigment and glue, which can be sanded, so that seals the wood. In this piece, That Gentleman by Andrew Wyeth from 1960, we're seeing the luminous qualities of tempera as the artist has used layers and layers to kind of create depth and reveal light and shadow. So here's a great example of that, how it looks like this is almost glowing because of the light coming in. He used kind of a restricted palette in this particular piece, but that's not always going to be the case when we look at tempera pieces. A good example of that is seen here, this piece by Jacob Lawrence from 1940. This is one of a series of images about the migration of thousands of African Americans to the North that began in 1910. He was drawn to the rough effects of tempera. So you can see that kind of revealed here. He's not using it to build up layers and to create a luminous effect. He's using it more to create kind of strong, sharp edges and more kind of a rough quality to it. This is another one by him in which you can see the vibrant color that tempera can create. But here, again, sharp lines, sharp angles, broad areas of color that temperas can be used for. It's not necessarily always going to be used in the more modern sense to create those luminous layers. This is an older piece, a tempera piece by Lippi, Madonna and Child from 1440 to 1445. So this is a great example of how tempera does not fade over time. You can still see a lot of beautiful detail. You can see this was used in layers to build up that kind of luminous quality again. It's not going to be as smooth a transition as we're going to see with oil painting from lights to dark. So for example, if you look at her drapery here, you can kind of see how it goes from light to dark, and it's almost like there's different layers of color being used as opposed to a blend, which we'll see later on in oil painting, which is what we're going to talk about now. So oil painting, the binder is oil. One of the benefits or negatives of oil painting, depending on how you look at it, is that it dries very slowly. I mean, it can take months for a painting to dry. You can work thick or thin, and depending on how you work, thick or thin, that's going to result in a certain look. If you work thick oil paint, it's called impasto, whereas if you work thin, it's going to be a glaze. In this particular piece by Jan van Eyck, A Man in Red Turban from 1433, we're seeing him use glazes, which are thin translucent veils of color over a thick underpainting, and those layers upon layers upon layers are going to allow the artist to create these really subtle transitions from light to dark to shadow. And you can see that it also creates a very vibrant color. Like if you look at the red here, this is a very vibrant, rich color that oil is known for. Unlike tempera, colors are going to change very little while drying. So that's a benefit of oil paint, is that you see what you get. You don't have to worry about that chemical reaction that's going to happen over time. So oil paint was invented in the early 15th century, and Jan van Eyck was one of the first artists to use it to its real potential. The reason it was developed was that they wanted something that was a little bit, that would allow for paintings to be larger and lighter. So canvas can be used, it can be painted on and then rolled up and shipped. Canvas is prepared, when canvas in oil painting is prepared by stretching it over a wooden frame and then sealing it with glue to protect the fibers. So here you can see glaze is thin translucent veils and impasto is thickly layered. So Bertha Morisset is known for her impasto techniques. This is Girl Arranging Her Hair from 1885. She's used bold slashing brush strokes, which you can see in the background. You can actually see the strokes of her brush, and you can see that in the foreground as well on the figure. She's built up thick layers of paint to create almost a textural look. We don't see that same kind of subtle shift between lights and darks here. It's more of a broken color look. Next, we're going to talk about watercolor. In watercolor, the binder is gum arabic. One of the reasons people choose to create paintings out of watercolor is that it's more of a small scale. It's going to be used to create transparent layers of paint, and the paper that it's painted on is actually used for the white. Anytime you see white in a watercolor painting, it's going to be the actual color of the paper. So this is Homer's Sloop from 1899. And in it, we're seeing kind of a lot of different things that watercolor is known for. So, for example, you can see the translucency of the paint here. You can see how the white is just the color of the paper that's been left bare. You can see how he's built up layers and kind of created darker colors by building up layers and of the different watercolors. Here's another one where we see white being used quite effectively. Great use of white paper. The artist is encouraging the paint to kind of do what it naturally does. So you can see kind of the brush stroke here, how the paint has gone to the edges, for example. So it's very translucent. You can see a lot of the qualities of watercolor by looking at this piece. So then we're going to go on to acrylic. In acrylic painting, the binder is acrylic resin. Acrylic was only recently developed in the 1930s and 1950s, where the other types of paint have been around for a long time, centuries. One of the great things about acrylic is that it mimics oil. It can mimic oil, watercolor, or tempera. So it can be kind of hard to tell the difference between an acrylic painting and an oil painting or a watercolor painting, depending on how the artist has used the paints. It can be opaque or translucent. So it can be, if it's used thickly and not watered down, it can be opaque. Or if it's watered down, it can be very transparent. This is Mount Fuji by David Hockney from 1972. We're actually seeing the two different techniques being used here. He's used a more thin, translucent acrylic in the background. It almost looks like watercolor, how thin the layers look. And then in the foreground, we're seeing that paint be thicker and more of an impasto technique that's mimicking oil painting. Another great thing about acrylics is that it can be used on canvas, paper, or fabric, wood, really any any ground it can be used on. It dries quickly, so it's a lot more quick to use than oil painting, and it's very permanent as well. Okay, so then lastly, we're going to talk about in painting, we're going to talk about collage. And collage is where real-world objects are used and attached to the canvas and then either painted on top of or drawn on top of. Picasso was one of the kind of initiators of this technique in the early 1900s. This is his guitar. And you can see some of the real-world objects include newspapers, some sort of decorative paper here, and then that's been used in addition to paint in the background, as well as this drawing media that you can see that are creating the lines. So our last chapter in this two-dimensional media section is prints, printmaking. Prints are created from a matrix. A matrix is a surface on which a design is prepared. So you can kind of think about any raised surface, such as like the bottom of your shoe, for example. If you walk through mud and then you walk on concrete, what's going to happen is that your shoe is going to leave a shoe print behind. And not just one, but multiple, right? So a print can create multiple images, and was really a result of industrialization. At least the popularity of prints in Western culture was a result of the industrialization going on. And prints can be used to create things that are produced like for mass production, but that's going to be different from what we see in art prints. In art prints, the artists are going to oversee the printing process, and a limited number of prints are going to be made, and that's called an edition when you see a limited number of prints being made and numbered, as well as signed by the artist. One of the great things about prints is that they're cheaper to produce, so therefore they're cheaper to buy, and you can reach more people through your artwork that way. So in printmaking, oops, just went through all of this. You're going to see 4 methods: intaglio, lithography, screen printing, and relief. So the first one that we're going to look at is relief printing. And relief printing is a process in which the image is raised from the background. A good example of that was the shoe or a rubber stamp. This is called a collagraph by a local artist named Heidi Lingenfelter from 2005. This is her 4 soils. We also have wood cuts, wood engravings, and lino cuts that are all going to be part of the relief process. In a collagraph, the artist is actually putting real materials onto the background and then pressing the paper, or inking it up and then pressing the paper onto that surface so that it really reveals that natural texture and look. This piece that we're looking at here, the Diamond Sutra from 868, is an example of a woodcut. A woodcut is where the artist draws an image on a block of wood and then carves it out. So the block is then inked, and of course the ink is only going to go on the raised areas. The paper is then placed on the block and then rubbed for the image to transfer. It lends itself to a bold black and white contrasting design, which we can definitely see here. Woodcuts originated in China, and this is one of the oldest surviving documents that we have from this area. The hardwood has been used to create many fine lines in this image. You don't really see a lot of shading. You really just see that more linear quality. This is another woodcut. This is by Dürer from 1497, called Four Horsemen. This was created after the printing press was developed in the mid-15th century, and he's illustrating a book of Revelations here. It's very detailed. You can see kind of how he's cutting the background, making it this very linear look to have some shading back there. So you can get very detailed, but it's hard to get the difference between lights and darks and get a smooth transition between those two when you're using woodcuts. So this piece is a wood engraving. A wood engraving is different from a woodcut in that it is done on the end grain. So there's not going to be any chipping or splitting that you have to worry about. And you can get a little bit more fine grooves than you can on the woodcut. So you can see that in this example, how it looks a lot more kind of fine, refined. You can see a little bit more of a transition between lights and darks here, for example. So what we were just talking about, the relief process, is where you're going to have the raised surface that will be inked, and then the background will remain blank, so white of the paper, and that's called a relief. And then we have intaglio, and intaglio is the opposite. So this is where the ink is going to be wiped off the surface and just remain in the grooves. The paper is then wet and rolled over the surface so you can actually see how it sinks into the grooves, and it will absorb the paint or the ink that way. So it's an opposite of a relief. The areas meant to print are below the surface. So in intaglio, artists are using tools or acid to make depressions in the plate that the print is made on. There's different types of intaglio, such as engraving and etching, as well as aquatint and mezzotint. The work that we're looking at here is an engraving. An engraving is where you take a burin, which is a sharp V-shaped tool, to cut into a metal plate. The deeper the groove, the darker the line. So you can actually make transitions between lights and darks here. This is the Judgment of Paris by Raphael from 1514. And in it, we're seeing him use cross-hatching and hatching to result in different values, which is very similar to drawing. But one of the main differences between printmaking and drawing is that printmaking is going to be an indirect process, meaning the artist is removed from the final image through a step. In this case, it's the carving of the plate, and then that plate is used to create the image, if that makes sense. So this is another piece by Dürer, The Night, Death, and the Devil from 1513. And I just wanted to compare it to the earlier image that we saw, which was the woodcut. And you can see how much different an engraving is and how fine the detail you can get. This the woodcut is much more linear, much more stark in its contrast, whereas the engraving is going to be more of a smooth transition from lights to darks. You don't really have that same linear quality, although you can see some lines being used for hatching. It doesn't have that same kind of stark separation between lights and darks. This is a mezzotint, and in a mezzotint, a rocker is used to roughen a metal surface. And with mezzotints, you're able to produce gradations and tones very nicely. So it's going to go from lights to darks very convincingly. The rougher the area, the darker the ink. So here we have an etching. And an etching is where you're going to have a coat. You're going to have the ground, the surface that you're printing off of. You're going to cover that with an acid-resistant substance. Then you're going to carve through that ground onto the plate. So you're not really marking up the plate. You're just carving through that initial material. Then you dip the metal plate in acid, and the acid eats away at the metal, but where the ground is, it doesn't eat away. Then you take the ground off and you can print the plate. So it is a sunken surface, and lines are going to be more easily produced this way because you're not having to use so much pressure to kind of carve into a plate. So in this piece by Rembrandt, we're seeing that it is a little bit more free. It's a little bit looser. I think I have a comparison here. Let me see. Yeah, so we can compare the piece by Dürer to this piece by Rembrandt, and you can see the difference between the etching and the engraving. Then we have an aquatint, and an aquatint is used to create flat areas of color. It's just a variation in etching. And an artist is going to use a register to have different colors present. A register is a device in which the paper that's being printed on can be put in the exact same spot that it was through the first, like you'll print one color, then you'll ink up your plate with another color. You'll put the paper in exactly the same spot, and then you'll put it through the press so that you can get two different colors or however many different colors you want. Okay, then we're going to talk about lithography. Lithography is a planographic process in which an artist is going to draw on limestone with a greasy material. You then soak the limestone in water and then ink it with greasy ink. The water in the stone resists the ink, and the ink sticks to the greasy drawn image. This is a more direct method than you'll see with the engravings and the etchings, because the artist is able to use more of kind of a painterly method with it. And you can see that painterly feel in this piece, Death and the Mother by Kollwitz from 1934. So in this one, you can see that direct quality. It looks as if that this has been a drawing or a painting, where in fact it is a print. So it's impressive how you can get that more direct quality with lithography. Okay, and then we have screen printing. Screen printing is like a stencil. So you're going to use a screen, and then you're going to put an image on that screen using a material that hardens in light. And wherever the light touches, that's going to be the spot where the screen stays blocked off. Okay. You can use multiple screens for multiple colors, or you can block off the areas that that you've already printed in one color if you want to print in a different color. There's no reversal of image in screen printing because you're going through the screen onto the paper rather than putting the paper on the surface. If that makes sense. So in this work by Reshka, Standard Station, we're seeing broad areas of uniform color that screen printing is known for, but you can also see in the background where we have a blend of two different colors that creates this kind of sunset look. Then we have monotypes. Monotypes are used to create one unique image, but it's different than painting because it is an indirect process. So you're going to draw with paint on a plate and then transfer it to paper. In this work by Shagoya, we're seeing a very layered image. So this artist has actually used multiple monotypes and then carefully controlled the transparency of the paint that the artist is using to create this layered look. So that's going to bring us to the end of chapters 6 through 8. I know there's a lot of vocabulary in there, so feel free to take pictures of those slides with all of the, the layouts of the, for example, on this one, we have the monoprint, and then it gives you all of those qualities of the monoprint, because I know that there's a lot to retain in these chapters. So I will see you next time with the three-dimensional media.